A millionaire forced his daughter to marry the beggar to punish her. However, he was surprised by what she did on her wedding day. In the heart of a sprawling metropolis, where high-rises touched the clouds and wealth was flaunted in grand displays, lived a man who was the embodiment of affluence and power. Edward Grayson was a self-made millionaire, a man whose name commanded respect in the business world and whose presence cast a shadow over all who dared oppose him. His rise to the top had been ruthless, calculated, a series of precisely executed decisions that had left competitors reeling and employees in awe. Grayson's company was a giant, swallowing up others as he climbed to the peak, wielding his influence without hesitation. Yet, his wealth was only a part of his identity. Control was his true obsession. Grayson believed deeply in the idea that money was the key to power, and power was meant to be wielded. Through careful manipulation and financial leverage, he held sway over his acquaintances, friends, and even his family. No decision was made without his approval, no plan enacted without his involvement. At home, his authority loomed as large as in his corporate empire. He relished his role as the ultimate decision-maker, directing every aspect of life around him as if conducting a symphony he alone could hear. Among those under his watchful gaze was his only daughter, Amelia. She had grown up in a world of marble floors and fine silks, of exclusive schools and private tutors. For Amelia, life's luxuries were an assumed privilege, not a distant dream. From a young age, she had the finest of everything: clothes that bespoke her status, vacations that swept her to exotic locations, and an entourage of people ready to fulfill her every wish. In Grayson's view, Amelia was his cherished possession, a jewel of the family legacy, and he intended for her life to reflect that status. Amelia, however, was young, vibrant, and curious. She had always questioned the boundaries imposed upon her, challenging the strict expectations her father laid out. Her interactions with the world, often beyond her father's knowledge, led her into spaces and situations he would never have permitted. She was drawn to the world beyond privilege, finding thrill in situations that had little to do with wealth. Amelia had a heart unburdened by class divides, a fascination with life's different faces, and a tendency to sympathize with those her father deemed insignificant. Unbeknownst to her, this attitude grated on her father's nerves. For him, her openness was a form of rebellion, a disrespect to the life he had carefully crafted for her. He could sense her growing independence, her desire to experience life beyond the sheltered bubble he had created. It was a bubble of luxury, yes, but also one of boundaries. And as her behavior grew bolder, Edward Grayson's patience grew thin, setting the stage for the punishment he would soon unleash, a punishment that would teach her a lesson he thought she desperately needed. As Amelia grew into adulthood, her spirit only seemed to grow wilder, and Edward Grayson's frustration reached new heights. In his eyes, his daughter was squandering the blessings that came with her name and position. Her choices too impulsive, too unrestrained. Instead of conforming to the social circles he deemed respectable, Amelia sought out friendships with artists, activists, and idealists, people whose ideals clashed with the values of wealth and status her father upheld. Edward saw her interactions as reckless. While he was attending business functions with the elite, she was slipping away to art shows held in abandoned warehouses, mingling with people he'd labeled as unworthy of her attention. Her disregard for his carefully curated world wasn't just a matter of irritation. It was, in his mind, a threat to the legacy he had worked so tirelessly to build. His name, his wealth, his power. Everything had been built to provide Amelia with a life of prestige, yet she seemed intent on rebelling against it. Despite his frequent lectures, Amelia only grew more defiant. Her choices seemed a direct affront to his authority, as if she were mocking everything he stood for. The lavish gifts he gave her were often met with disinterest, and she spoke of pursuing her own dreams, ones he couldn't understand and certainly didn't approve of. How could she be so ungrateful? Didn't she realize that everything she enjoyed, every comfort she took for granted, was the result of his sacrifices? To Edward, Amelia's carefree attitude was not just naive but irresponsible. She seemed determined to associate with people he deemed beneath her, people who lacked ambition and means, traits Edward despised. Watching his daughter drift further into a world he viewed as chaotic and meaningless filled him with a sense of urgency. He feared she was descending into a reckless spiral, one that would ruin her and tarnish their family's reputation. To Edward, her behavior was not merely youthful indiscretion. It was a dangerous path that could lead to disgrace. After another heated argument, one where Amelia dismissed his concerns with an exasperated laugh, he felt something snap inside him. His patience had finally reached its breaking point. He had allowed her freedom, given her everything, and yet she refused to respect the life he'd painstakingly created. In his mind, she had taken advantage of his leniency for too long. It was time to intervene in a way she couldn't ignore, a way that would open her eyes to the true value of the life she so casually disregarded. Edward believed that his daughter needed to learn a lesson, one that would humble her and remind her of her place. And the more he thought about it, the more a drastic plan began to take shape in his mind. If she couldn't understand the value of privilege, then perhaps he could force her to experience the world without it. As Edward Grayson's frustration simmered, he retreated to his private study, a grand room lined with leather-bound books and heavy oak furniture, each piece meticulously chosen to reflect his tastes and stature. The walls held the trophies of his success, awards, accolades, and mementos from every rung of his climb to wealth and power. Here, surrounded by the symbols of his achievements, Edward pondered the path his daughter was heading down and, more urgently, how he could force her to see the error of her ways. Hours passed as he sat alone, reflecting on his options, dismissing each one until he settled on an idea so drastic that even he hesitated. What if, he thought, she could experience what life was like on the other side, the side without wealth, influence, or any of the privileges she'd grown up with? Only then might she understand the worth of what she was throwing away so carelessly. He could strip her of the comforts she took for granted and bring her face to face with a life of hardship, of need. Then an idea struck him, one that felt extreme but, in his view, necessary. He would force her into a marriage, a binding commitment to someone far beneath her social class. Not to any ordinary man either, but to someone whose lack of status and wealth would make the lesson in humility undeniable. It had to be someone whose presence alone would make the disparity in their lives painfully clear. The man he chose would be a beggar, someone who knew the sting of poverty and whom Amelia would find impossible to dismiss. To Edward, this plan felt like justice. He could already picture his daughter humbled, forced to confront the realities she'd so blithely ignored. A beggar husband, he thought, would be a constant reminder of everything she'd taken for granted. The marriage would shock her, awaken her, and ultimately break her defiance. He would make sure that she understood what life was like for those who had to struggle for every penny, for whom survival was a daily challenge. He began to make arrangements, pulling strings to locate a man who fit his requirements, a beggar from the city streets, with no family, no resources, and no future prospects. Edward's connections ensured that this arrangement could be done quietly, without any fuss or gossip reaching his social circle. It would be a controlled, calculated plan, one that would set his daughter straight once and for all. With a grim satisfaction, Edward leaned back in his chair, confident that he had devised the ultimate lesson. Amelia would learn humility, he assured himself. She would come out of this experience broken of her rebellious ways, reshaped to appreciate the privileges he had so carefully laid out for her. In his mind there was no doubt. This marriage would be the solution, and she would thank him in time. When Amelia heard of her father's plan, she was convinced it was a cruel joke, some exaggerated threat designed to frighten her back into obedience. But as she saw the cold determination in his eyes, disbelief turned to horror. She felt the ground shift beneath her, and in a panicked haze, she found herself searching for any sign of compassion or reason on her father's face. There was none. "Marry a beggar," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. "You can't be serious, father. This is insane." Her father's expression remained impassive, his steely gaze fixed on her. "Amelia," he began, his voice measured and resolute, "you have spent your life ignoring the privileges I've given you. It's time you understand what the world is like for those who have nothing. You seem to think money is trivial, that you're above the responsibilities that come with it. Well, if you refuse to respect the life I've built, then you'll live a different one, at least until you learn some humility." Amelia's heart pounded as she tried to process the implications of his words. Every plea she offered, every reason she tried to give, met with stony resistance. She argued that he had no right to control her life this way, that she would never forgive him for forcing her into a loveless marriage. But he brushed aside her protests, unmoved by her anger and tears. He made it clear that this was not a negotiation. Her fate was sealed. Desperate, Amelia threatened to leave, to abandon her family if he went through with this madness. But her father had anticipated her defiance and was unrelenting. He reminded her that she had no access to her wealth, no means to survive without his support. "You can leave, Amelia, but you'll leave with nothing," he said coldly, his words a final blow. "Perhaps then you'll see the world more clearly." The gravity of her situation hit her like a wave. There was no escape from this punishment, no path that would lead her back to the life she knew. Her father had ensured that her choices were limited, her autonomy reduced to a single cruelly twisted option: marry a beggar or face the harsh reality of life on her own, with nothing but the clothes on her back. The betrayal cut deep, leaving her heart heavy with despair. How could her father, her own flesh and blood, subject her to such a fate? Her hands trembled as she tried to imagine her future, forced into a life with a stranger who shared none of her past, her ambitions, or her world. She knew only that he was a beggar, a man living in poverty and hardship, and now he would be her husband. Her defiance simmered, but trapped under her father's will. Her fight felt small and fragile. Yet, even as her spirit buckled, a spark of resistance remained, a whisper that urged her to find a way through this nightmare. Amelia's father's search led him to a man named Samuel, a beggar who frequented a quiet corner near a bustling market, unnoticed by the wealthy patrons and forgotten by most passers-by. Samuel had lived a life that bore little resemblance to Amelia's, marked by hardship, resilience, and a humble acceptance of his fate. Despite his circumstances, there was a quiet dignity in Samuel, an air of calm that drew people's glances, though he asked for nothing and rarely spoke. He had learned to survive with almost nothing, finding solace in simplicity and a quiet faith that carried him through each day. When Edward Grayson approached him with the unusual proposal, Samuel was taken aback. A marriage, and to the daughter of a man so powerful that he could make such an arrangement without a hint of reluctance. Samuel's instincts warned him against it. He'd heard tales of the wealthy and the whims they indulged. This proposal sounded like another such whim, a plan hatched by a man who cared little for the hearts or dignity of others. But Edward's terms were clear. Samuel would receive a substantial sum for his compliance, enough to elevate him from the poverty he had endured his whole life. For someone like Samuel, the offer was difficult to refuse. After much thought, Samuel reluctantly agreed. It wasn't just the money that persuaded him but the prospect of change, of stepping beyond the life he'd been confined to for so long. He knew he was seen as little more than a pawn in this wealthy man's scheme, yet he sensed something greater in the opportunity. Perhaps it was fate, or perhaps his years of hardship had cultivated in him a willingness to embrace the unknown. As he approached the Grayson estate for the first time, Samuel's simple clothing and unassuming manner made him an odd sight against the grandeur of the mansion. The opulence was overwhelming, the polished floors and gleaming chandeliers a stark contrast to the world he knew. But Samuel was not one to be intimidated. He maintained a quiet humility, standing with a steady gaze that met the disapproving stares of the household staff without faltering. When he was finally introduced to Amelia, the two shared a silent moment, each appraising the other. She looked at him with thinly veiled contempt, her eyes brimming with resentment. To her, he was nothing more than a symbol of her father's betrayal, a stranger who represented everything she loathed about the situation she was trapped in. Samuel, however, remained calm, offering her a faint, understanding smile. He saw the anguish in her eyes, the pain that her proud stance tried to conceal. Though he could feel her disdain, Samuel held no anger toward her. He understood what she felt. After all, his life too had been filled with unchosen paths and undeserved hardships. He resolved to be patient, hoping that in time she might see him as more than just a beggar forced into her life. As the days passed and the wedding date crept closer, the tension between Amelia and her father grew more unbearable, casting a shadow over the entire household. Amelia was determined to resist in any way she could, hoping to show her father that she would not bend so easily. She spent her days pacing the mansion in frustration, her mind swirling with plans to escape the marriage, to find some loophole or way out of the life she saw slipping from her control. Every glance at her father reminded her of her helplessness, a feeling that gnawed at her pride and drove her further into anger. She considered pleading one last time, perhaps appealing to any remaining compassion in him, but she knew it would be futile. She had seen his resolve, the cold satisfaction he took in her discomfort, convinced that he was teaching her a lesson in humility. The more she fought against it, the more he seemed certain that his decision was right. The household staff watched in uneasy silence, sensing the undercurrents of resentment and desperation. They had always known Amelia as a spirited young woman, lively and warm. But now, she was a different person, her joy dulled and her laughter silenced, replaced by a sharp bitterness that made them look away when she passed. Rumors circulated about her father's drastic plan, whispers that painted him as both ruthless and heartless. But no one dared question his authority. Amelia's feelings toward Samuel were just as complicated. In her mind, he was a mere tool in her father's twisted punishment, someone she'd been forced to marry to satisfy her father's need for control. Every time she encountered Samuel, she barely met his gaze, avoiding any interaction that might make the reality of her situation more painful. She viewed him with a mixture of contempt and pity, unable to see past his ragged clothes and humble demeanor. To her, he was simply a beggar, an unwanted presence in the gilded cage her father had built. Samuel, on the other hand, handled her coldness with quiet dignity. He did not press her, nor did he retaliate against her dismissiveness. He recognized her pain and knew that he was a reminder of her father's betrayal. Still, his patience remained unshaken. He treated her with gentle respect, even when she ignored him or looked at him with disdain. Despite the insults she sometimes threw his way, he responded only with calm, a soft-spoken kindness that seemed foreign to her. But this kindness only deepened Amelia's frustration. She wanted him to react, to give her a reason to lash out, but he refused to be drawn into her resentment. Instead, he met her bitterness with a quiet empathy that disarmed her, leaving her feeling unsettled and more trapped than before. She couldn't understand why he, of all people, was the one showing patience, while she was the one writhing in helpless fury. As the wedding loomed closer, Amelia resolved that if she had to go through with this marriage, she would do it on her own terms. She would not let her father see her broken. Even if the ceremony went forward, she would find a way to disrupt his plan, to somehow reclaim her independence, even if only in a small, symbolic act. The morning of the wedding dawned under a sky thick with gray clouds, casting a somber hue over the lavish Grayson estate. Inside, preparations for the ceremony buzzed with brisk efficiency. Yet, the usual warmth and excitement of a wedding day were absent. The staff moved about with nervous energy, sensing the tension that hung like a shadow over the occasion. They knew this was not a celebration of love but a show of power, a stark lesson from father to daughter. Amelia sat in her dressing room, her eyes fixed on her reflection. The gown she wore was exquisite, crafted from fine lace and shimmering silk, but she felt like a stranger in it. It was a dress she'd once dreamed of wearing under different circumstances, yet now, as it draped her shoulders, it felt more like a prison than a piece of art. Her heart felt as heavy as the silence in the room, each passing second driving home the reality that this day, her wedding day, was nothing more than her father's final attempt to break her spirit. As she adjusted her veil, Amelia felt her hands tremble. She had always imagined her wedding as a day of joy, surrounded by loved ones and filled with laughter. But instead, here she was, preparing to marry a man she did not know and did not want, with her father's cold, unyielding presence as her only witness. Her thoughts flickered with resentment and pain, but she steeled herself, determined to show no weakness, no sign of the despair clawing at her heart. In the grand hall, Samuel stood quietly, his simple attire a striking contrast to the luxury surrounding him. He wore a modest suit, a plain shirt and jacket that had been lent to him for the occasion. His gaze was calm, his expression composed, though a hint of solemnity shadowed his eyes. He understood the nature of this event, that he was here not as a groom but as a tool for a wealthy man's lesson. And yet, he held no resentment, accepting his role with the dignity he had always carried, even when he had nothing. As Amelia walked down the aisle, she caught sight of her father's face. His gaze stern and satisfied, convinced that he had finally achieved the lesson he sought to teach. She felt a surge of defiance rise within her, a final glimmer of her unyielding spirit. She would not let him see her broken. No, she would endure this without giving him the satisfaction of witnessing her pain. As she reached the altar, Samuel looked at her with a gentle, understanding expression. His presence, humble and unassuming, brought an odd sense of calm to her turmoil. And as the vows began, she felt her resolve harden, a final decision forming in her mind. She was ready to make her move, one that would turn the tables in a way her father could never have predicted. As the officiant's words drifted through the hall, Amelia's heartbeat pounded louder in her ears. She glanced at her father, standing with a slight smirk, his satisfaction palpable as he watched his carefully laid plan unfold. His expression confirmed what she had feared. He believed he had won, that he had succeeded in bending her to his will. But standing at the altar, with Samuel at her side, Amelia felt a surge of clarity and strength she hadn't expected. The officiant reached the moment when Amelia was to repeat her vows. All eyes turned to her, waiting for her to comply, to finally submit to her father's scheme. Taking a deep breath, Amelia looked into Samuel's eyes. In them she saw no judgment, no expectation, just a calm acceptance of the situation, and an unspoken promise that he would honor whatever choice she made. And in that gaze, Amelia found an unexpected ally. With a steady voice, she began to speak, but instead of following the officiant's words, she lifted her chin and addressed the guests directly. "I stand here today, not by choice but by compulsion," she began, her voice unwavering, yet laced with a quiet defiance. The room stilled, and a ripple of surprise passed through the guests as her words broke the script of the ceremony. Her father's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading as he realized she was not about to simply obey. "Today, I am to marry a man whom I did not choose. This is my father's punishment, a punishment for daring to live freely, to explore a world outside his control." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the silence. "But if my father believes that this marriage will humiliate or break me, he is mistaken." She turned to Samuel, her voice softening but filled with resolve. "I will not treat this man with disdain or contempt, as my father intended. I will embrace this marriage, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to live on my own terms. I choose to respect and honor him, just as I would any other partner in life." Her father's face turned ashen, his control slipping for the first time as her words shattered the certainty he'd held so tightly. Amelia took Samuel's hand, a gesture that felt empowering, a declaration that she would not be a pawn in her father's game. Her choice to embrace this marriage, not out of submission but out of strength, sent a shockwave through the room. With this simple act, she turned her father's punishment into her own powerful statement. Her defiance lay not in rebellion, but in acceptance, an acceptance that showed she was no longer under his control. For the first time, she was acting out of her own agency, carving a path defined by her own will and resilience. The room erupted into murmurs, guests casting uneasy glances between Amelia and her father. But Amelia held her ground, knowing that she had won, not by escaping her father's plan, but by transforming it into a decision that was wholly hers. Edward Grayson's face was a portrait of stunned disbelief. For the first time in his life, he felt a total loss of control, the power he had always wielded slipping through his fingers. He had orchestrated this entire plan, carefully crafting each detail, certain that Amelia would bow to his will. But now, standing in front of the gathered guests, she had appended his scheme in a way he could never have anticipated. Her declaration, her refusal to let his punishment define her, left him shaken, exposed. As murmurs swept through the room, Edward's face flushed, anger and humiliation flickering across his usually composed expression. He had intended to teach her a lesson, to make her see the consequences of her choices. Yet, in front of everyone, she had turned that lesson against him, challenging his authority in a way that struck at his very core. The room full of his peers, business associates, and society's elite had been meant to witness her submission. Instead, they now witnessed his defeat. Struggling to keep his composure, Edward's gaze bore into Amelia, a mix of fury and disbelief in his eyes. How could she take his meticulously crafted punishment and turn it into a statement of her own power? In that moment, he realized that his daughter was far stronger and more independent than he had ever given her credit for. This wasn't the meek compliance he had expected. It was a bold defiance, a clear message that she would live by her own rules, not his. Samuel, standing beside Amelia with quiet dignity, did not meet Edward's glare. He remained calm, understanding the complexity of the situation but resolute in his silent support for Amelia. Edward's own chosen pawn had shown him a quiet strength, an inner peace that further twisted the knife. Samuel was no longer just a beggar in Edward's eyes. He was the man who had helped Amelia to defy him, simply by standing at her side. For Edward, this moment felt like a loss he couldn't rectify, a defeat that reverberated far beyond the walls of the Grand Hall. His carefully maintained image of control, of authority over his family, had been shattered. He knew that there was no going back, no chance to reverse what Amelia had made so public. The audience's murmurs grew louder, their glances sympathetic but tinged with curiosity, some even with pity. In that fractured silence, Edward's face revealed something more vulnerable, a glimpse of a man who, for all his power and wealth, had lost the one thing he had always taken for granted: his role as Amelia's unquestioned guide. His gaze softened, if only for a moment, as the reality settled in. His daughter had grown beyond his control, beyond the confines he had built for her. And in her strength, he felt a hint of regret, the first stirrings of doubt in a lifetime of certainty. As Amelia and Samuel stood together, hands clasped, Edward found himself grappling with an unfamiliar emotion, a complex blend of admiration and remorse, hidden beneath his bruised pride. The plan he had so confidently crafted had not humbled his daughter. Instead, it had revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. She was no longer a girl under his command, but a woman determined to chart her own course, even if it meant standing against him. After the wedding, the estate seemed almost hauntingly quiet, as if the very walls absorbed the magnitude of what had taken place. Amelia moved through the halls of her home with a newfound sense of clarity, her mind still reeling from the events of the day. The ceremony had closed a chapter of her life, and though the weight of her father's betrayal still lingered, she felt something new, a glimmer of freedom, a strength she hadn't known before. When she looked at Samuel now, the disdain she had initially felt was gone. Instead, there was a curiosity, a hesitant openness that surprised her. She no longer saw him merely as a beggar thrust into her life, but as a person who, like her, had been pulled into circumstances beyond his control. In his quiet, calm presence, she found a comforting steadiness, a contrast to the storm of emotions she had endured in recent days. Samuel's demeanor, humble yet dignified, piqued her curiosity. How did someone with so little find peace within himself, a peace that even the richest could not attain? Living together, she began to see life from a perspective she had never considered. Samuel possessed no riches, no worldly possessions of value, yet he was untroubled by that lack. He didn't cling to things or titles, and he approached each day with gratitude for whatever it offered. Watching him adapt to their new life without complaint or bitterness made her reflect on her own life of luxury, which she had once taken for granted and even resented at times. Their days were simple, their home modest compared to the grand mansion she had known, but there was a quiet beauty in the simplicity. No longer burdened by her father's expectations, Amelia found herself appreciating small, ordinary moments she once overlooked. The warmth of the morning sun streaming through their small kitchen window, the comforting routine of shared meals with Samuel, the gentle ease with which he greeted each day. These experiences planted a seed of introspection within her, prompting her to question everything she had once valued. As Amelia spent time with Samuel, she also began to see glimpses of his kindness and patience. He listened without judgment, answered her questions thoughtfully, and never pressured her to accept him as a partner. He allowed her space, understanding the emotional journey she was on, and respected her independence, a respect she had rarely experienced, even in her world of privilege. With Samuel, she felt a newfound sense of peace and acceptance, unencumbered by the demands of wealth or reputation. Slowly, Amelia found herself softening, her resentment dissipating like mist under the morning sun. Her father's punishment, designed to teach her humility, had instead granted her a chance to redefine her life, free from the constraints of her past. And as the days turned into weeks, Amelia realized that the lessons she was learning now were shaping her into someone her former self would hardly recognize. Living alongside Samuel, Amelia couldn't help but notice his quiet resilience, a strength that went beyond physical endurance and touched something deeply human. He moved through life with a patience and gentleness that were foreign to her previous experiences. Despite the hardships he had faced, Samuel approached each day with a calm that both mystified and comforted her, revealing qualities she never would have expected in a man society viewed as lowly. Amelia began to observe Samuel more closely, noting how he treated everyone he encountered with respect, regardless of their station or wealth, or lack thereof. The baker's wife, the children playing in the streets, even the neighbors who looked at him with suspicion or pity, Samuel met them all with the same quiet smile and a word of kindness. He seemed immune to judgment, unaffected by the disdain or pity others directed his way, and this unbreakable calm had a profound effect on Amelia, who had grown up in a world ruled by appearances and unspoken hierarchies. In their humble home, Samuel's patience was especially evident. He approached the most menial tasks with care, never rushing, never begrudging the work. He would fix things around the house with a focus that bordered on reverence, treating each small chore as if it were significant. Whenever he could, he would bring her small tokens, a fresh loaf of bread, wildflowers from the nearby fields, or a book he thought she might enjoy. These gestures, simple yet thoughtful, showed a consideration she had rarely experienced, even in the most extravagant displays of wealth. Amelia found herself moved by these small acts of kindness. Unlike the grand gestures she had been accustomed to, Samuel's gestures were unpretentious and genuine, asking nothing in return. He never tried to impose on her or demand affection. Instead, he gave her space to process her own feelings and come to terms with their shared life. His restraint, his respect for her independence, slowly melted the walls she had built around herself. One evening, as they sat by a modest fire, Amelia dared to ask him about his past, wondering what had shaped a man so unburdened by resentment. Samuel spoke of his life without bitterness, recounting his struggles with a gentle acceptance that she couldn't fully comprehend. He shared stories of times when he had nothing, when survival itself had been a daily challenge. Yet through it all, he had found solace in small moments of kindness and joy, choosing to focus on what he had rather than what he lacked. In his words, Amelia sensed a profound resilience, a quiet dignity that stemmed from a life lived in acceptance. Samuel's humility and grace filled her with an unexpected admiration, a respect that transcended the divide of wealth or social status. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was a strength in simplicity, a strength she had never been taught to value. As the weeks turned into months, Amelia felt herself changing in ways she hadn't anticipated. The resentment and anger she had carried after her father's betrayal began to soften, replaced by a quiet introspection. Living in simplicity alongside Samuel, she found herself reflecting on the life she had once led and the values she had taken for granted. The glittering parties, designer gowns, and high society circles seemed trivial now, almost foreign. In their place, a new appreciation for life's simpler moments took root within her. Amelia began to embrace the small routines of their life together. She discovered a sense of satisfaction in the daily tasks that once would have felt beneath her. Cooking meals with Samuel, tending a small garden, or simply sharing a quiet evening brought her a peace she hadn't known in her gilded life. Each day unfolded without the pressures of status or reputation, and she found herself savoring the sense of freedom that came with it. The weight of her father's expectations was gone, replaced by a joy that arose from within, a joy unconnected to wealth or power. The Amelia who once scoffed at humility now sought it out, drawn to the strength she saw in Samuel's gentleness. She began to question her old beliefs, to see value in the people and lives she had once overlooked. Through Samuel's patience and compassion, she came to understand that there was a richness in character that went beyond material wealth. Samuel had given her something priceless, a sense of self that was unchained from her father's influence. More surprising to her, though, was the deepening connection she felt with Samuel. His kindness and unassuming nature had shifted from something she tolerated to something she admired and cherished. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, discovering insights in his stories and wisdom in his observations. He had a way of seeing the world that was both simple and profound, a perspective that grounded her and opened her heart to new ways of thinking. The disdain she once felt toward him faded, replaced by an affection that grew with each passing day. One evening, as they sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, Amelia realized just how far she had come. Her life of luxury, once a source of pride, now felt like a distant memory. She no longer missed the opulence or the constant validation of her status. Instead, she was content in this life with Samuel, content to build a future on a foundation of humility and mutual respect. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Amelia felt a quiet resolve form within her. She knew that this transformation was no temporary change, no momentary adjustment. Her heart and mind had shifted in a way that would not be undone. She had found peace and purpose in simplicity, in values unconnected to wealth, and she was ready to fully embrace this new life. In a way her father could never have foreseen, she had discovered the true strength of her own spirit. Amelia awoke one morning with a sense of purpose that was new, yet felt entirely natural. She had spent months in quiet reflection, exploring her values and discovering the peace that lay in the simplicity of her life with Samuel. The resentment toward her father had faded, replaced by a sense of gratitude, not for his harshness, but for the unexpected path his punishment had led her down. She felt for the first time that her life was her own. As she looked around their modest home, Amelia felt a warmth and contentment that she had never experienced in her father's mansion. Here, every corner was touched by her own choices, her own efforts alongside Samuel's. The walls were adorned not with expensive art, but with memories of shared moments. A simple bouquet of wildflowers Samuel had brought one day, or a small painting she had made of their view of the sunset. Their life was modest, but it was rich in ways that truly mattered. Embracing this life meant letting go of the illusions she had once held dear. She no longer yearned for the approval of high society or the comfort of her father's wealth. Instead, she found fulfillment in small accomplishments. Growing their own vegetables, repairing their home with her own hands, sharing laughter and quiet moments with Samuel. These simple, grounding acts brought a sense of pride that she could never have imagined before. She felt strong and independent, connected to herself in a way that had nothing to do with luxury or privilege. One evening, as she sat with Samuel under the stars, she took his hand and spoke words that felt like a culmination of her journey. "I never thought I could find happiness outside of the world I knew," she began, her voice soft yet sure. "But I've learned more here in this simple life than I ever did surrounded by wealth. I choose this life, Samuel. I choose it because it's real, and it's built on something solid, something my father's money could never give me." Samuel looked at her, his gentle gaze filled with understanding. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to make her feel that she had made the right decision. They sat in silence, hand in hand, under a vast sky that now seemed filled with endless possibilities. In that moment, Amelia knew that she was free, not just from her father's control, but from the constraints of her own past. Amelia's journey had led her to a place of self-discovery, a life she had chosen wholeheartedly. It was a life shared with a man she had come to respect and care for, a man whose humble spirit had shown her what true strength looked like. Her future was no longer dictated by wealth or expectations, but by the choices she would make with an open heart. Back in the Grayson mansion, Edward Grayson sat alone in his study, his heart weighed down by a growing sense of regret. The echoes of Amelia's wedding day, her public declaration, and her final act of defiance had stayed with him, haunting him like an unfinished sentence. For months, he had maintained a facade of indifference, unwilling to face the implications of what he had done. Yet, in the quiet moments when no one else was around, he could no longer escape the truth of his own actions. He had tried to break Amelia, to teach her a lesson in humility, yet she had emerged stronger, more independent, and further out of his reach. Instead of making her obedient, his plan had backfired, forcing her into a life that had reshaped her beyond recognition. In trying to control her, he had severed their bond, a bond he had always taken for granted, assuming she would always return to him, that she would always need him. Now she was building a life that didn't include him, a life that, despite all his efforts, seemed to make her happier than the one he had envisioned. As Edward sat there, the emptiness of his mansion seemed more palpable than ever. The grand halls and luxurious rooms, once filled with reminders of his power, now felt hollow. He had spent his life building an empire, accumulating wealth and influence, believing that these things would ensure respect, loyalty, and love. But none of it had kept his daughter close. He could feel the weight of his own miscalculations pressing down on him, a realization that came with a rare humility. His mind drifted back to memories of Amelia as a young girl, her laughter filling the mansion, her curiosity endless. She had always been spirited, independent, and full of life, qualities he had once admired. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped nurturing those qualities, replacing his love with control, his pride with demands. In his attempt to mold her into his vision, he had overlooked the very essence of who she was. Now she was gone, her life entwined with that of a man he had once dismissed as unworthy. And yet, Edward couldn't ignore the quiet dignity and strength he had glimpsed in Samuel. Perhaps Amelia had seen something he had been too blind to recognize, a value that wasn't tied to wealth or power, but to character. For the first time, Edward Grayson found himself questioning the path he had taken, the choices he had made not only for Amelia but for himself. He realized, with a pang of sorrow, that he had lost more than just control. He had lost his daughter's trust, her respect, and perhaps her love. And the life she now lived, far from his influence, was the life she had chosen of her own free will, a choice he could no longer shape. As time passed, Edward Grayson could no longer ignore the ache left by his estrangement from Amelia. His once steadfast resolve had crumbled, replaced by a quiet yearning to reconnect with his daughter, even if it meant facing the reality of his own mistakes. Pride had kept him silent, but as he saw Amelia's life from a distance, a life she was living with dignity and joy, he realized that it was no longer about control or authority. This was about his desire as a father to know the woman she had become. One afternoon, Edward made the decision to reach out. He composed a simple letter, choosing each word carefully. In it, he expressed his acknowledgement of her strength and the choices she had made, though he stopped short of a full apology. Yet, there was a softness in his words, an unspoken admission of respect that hadn't been there before. He ended the letter with an invitation to meet, leaving the decision in her hands. For the first time, he was giving her the choice. Amelia received the letter with mixed emotions. She had built a life away from him, a life defined by her own values and choices, yet there was a part of her that still felt the pull of family, the thread that connected them despite everything. Samuel encouraged her to consider the meeting, reminding her that forgiveness, even if only partial, could bring peace. With his quiet support, Amelia agreed to meet her father in the familiar halls of the Grayson mansion. When they finally met, their conversation was tentative, marked by pauses and unspoken words. Edward was visibly older, wearier, his pride softened by months of reflection. He looked at Amelia with a depth of regard that was unfamiliar, tinged with both regret and admiration. "You've done well for yourself, Amelia," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "I see that now. I see everything I was blind to before." Amelia held his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. She had no need to prove herself to him anymore, yet she sensed that he was offering her something he'd never given her before, a genuine respect, an acknowledgement of her worth beyond the role he'd tried to impose. "Thank you, Father," she replied, her tone gentle but steady. "I found my own path, with or without your approval, and I'm happy. I hope you can accept that." In the silence that followed, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Edward nodded, his pride giving way to a faint, sincere smile. Though their relationship would never return to what it had once been, there was a sense of closure, a shared recognition of both past mistakes and newfound acceptance. They parted that day not as adversaries, but with a quiet, tentative peace. Amelia left the mansion with a lighter heart, ready to move forward in her life with Samuel, while Edward remained, reflecting on the path that had led him there. In his solitude, he found a sliver of peace, knowing he had, at last, taken a step toward mending the bond he had nearly destroyed.